Holy God, source of all light, by your word you give light to the soul, and we ask you to pour out on us today the spirit of wisdom and understanding, so being taught by your word, our hearts and minds may be open to know the things that pertain to life and holiness. In Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Now, our scripture readings today are a little bit different because we're trying to tell the story of Moses, and I've taken things from, as you can see, a number of different places. And there are many others I could have chosen, but I tried to keep it as compact as I could and yet try to tell the story as completely as I could. So you'll find those in the bulletin, and I'm going to read them from the monitor today instead of these pages. But if you remember, our last great Old Testament story, as I've been calling them, was about Joseph. And at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph died, and now the next book in Exodus, we pick up our reading there as we focus on the story of Moses. So we begin with Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them." And then from verse 14. So they, that is the Egyptians, were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them, the Israelites. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwife, "When you act as midwife to the Hebrew women, see them on the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, she shall live." And then at the beginning of Exodus chapter 2, it tells about how Moses' mother helped save Moses' life. And then he grew up in the household of the Egyptian king. So now we turn to Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. After a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Jacob. Then in chapter 3, Moses is keeping flocks for his father-in-law, Jethro, and something amazing happens. And we pick up this reading in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry and their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. So come, I will send you," he's talking to Moses, "to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But as we heard on the video, and as we shared with our young worshiper today, Moses was reluctant to do this job. But eventually, he agreed to do it and went before the Egyptian king to say that the Lord wanted the Israelites to leave Egypt. But the king kept refusing Moses' request. But after the Lord sent 10 plagues upon Egypt, the king finally agreed that they could leave. And then we pick up our last set of readings in chapter 14, beginning with verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done? Let Israel leave our service." The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to him. They said to Moses, "What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt?" But Moses said to the people, "The Lord will fight for you." then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its depth. The Egyptians fled before the Lord, tossed the Egyptians into the sea. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. When I think about this series that are calling Great Old Testament Stories, I think there's one thing that's true about all of them, and that it's hard to do justice to them in just one sermon. But I wanted to keep it one sermon for each. And so I invite you to go back and read about all the other interesting stories and details that I'm leaving out, and especially I feel today with all the stories of Moses. And you can read about them in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you're looking for the story about the Exodus itself and Moses part of that, as I said, our story today begins kind of where we left off a couple of weeks ago with the story of Moses, kind of a new day in Egypt. And remember, Joseph ended up in Egypt because his brothers sold him off to traders. Then God's help, he rose to number 2 position in Egypt. When a famine arose back in Canaan, where his people were, and Jacob sent his sons to get grain there, Joseph helped them and saved his people from the famine. And then they all moved down to Egypt because the Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, liked Joseph so much, he welcomed them and gave them a good place to live. But eventually, there was a new Egyptian king. Joseph had died, and they enslaved the Israelite people. And in Exodus chapter 1, it talks about how the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, were to kill the newly born Hebrew boys, but the boys. So this is where Moses' story begins. And with something that we might call some loving trickery, his mother not only saved Moses' life, but he was raised in the house of the Egyptian king, Pharaoh. When Moses was a young man, he moved to Midian. There's more to that story too, I will read. But he married the daughter of the man he was working for. But meanwhile, back in Egypt, his enslaved people were crying out to God for help because their life was so hard. And Moses would end up being at the core of bringing that help to his people. Now, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is killed in Midian, and then, as we heard about it in the video today, one of the best known stories that I think of the Bible takes place. There's Moses tending his flock, and an angel of the Lord speaks to him out of the bush, but the bush is not consumed by the fire. That would get our attention. And God said to Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember that? Going back to what God has made with his people. And the Lord said, I've heard the cry of your people, Moses, and I'm going to bring them out of Egypt, and I'm going to lead them back to the land. And guess who was to be the leader of all this? Yes, it was Moses. But again, we look at this story about how Moses responded to his call. I think this is an important part of this story. And here was Moses' first reaction to God's plan. Who am I, Moses, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites? But God quickly reassured Moses that he would be with him. And isn't that the greatest assurance of all, that God will be with us? But Moses had another question for God, despite assurance. He asked, what if I say to the Israelites, God of your ancestors, to you, and they ask me, what is his name? God said to Moses to tell them, my name is I am who I am. And also tell them that I have sent you, Moses, to your people. So God basically said to Moses, now get going and get started with this job I have for you, to bring the people out of their misery, to get them out of Egypt. And the Lord said, I'm even going to strike the country with some real wonders so that the king will let you go. But Moses had another question of God. Suppose that my people will not listen to me or believe me. So God said, well, I'll do some things like I'll take your staff and turn it into a snake and turn it back to a staff, so they will believe. But Moses came up with still another objection. He said, oh Lord, I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord had a question for Moses. He said, who gives speech to mortals? God. And he said, I will be with you and teach you what you are to speak. Now, God said, get going. But Moses tried one last time to change God's mind. He said, please send someone. And with that, God got angry with him. Okay, I'm going to send your brother Aaron with you to go and speak to the Pharaoh and to tell the Pharaoh to let my people, the Israelites, go. So Moses then went back to Egypt and got on with what God told him to do. But it took a lot for him. But he was the right one. Maybe stop doubting that he could do what really God was calling him to do. Now, if a king, at least from what I know about most kings, didn't like what you had to say, didn't like what you're asking for, maybe you just didn't like the way you look, he could just have you put to death. So I think we've got to cut Moses a little bit of slack here, because he was given a very daunting and really dangerous job to go before the king who wanted to keep the people enslaved and keep them in Egypt and ask for their release. But here's the real kicker to the reluctance of Moses that we've heard before, and that is more than once, go and I will be with you. Moses finally trusted that. It wasn't too easy. But I think that same promise holds for us today. If God says to us, I've got a job for you. I want you to do this, go here, say this, whatever it is. And maybe we say, well, Lord, this job's over, maybe even way over my head. But God says to us, no, this is the job I have for you. I'll be with you, you can do it. And I think the same thing that he said to Moses is what he would say to us. Any reluctance we have, get going, and I will be with you to accomplish this. So Moses and Aaron, they did what God asked them to do. They repeatedly went before the Egyptian king, that the Lord said to let people leave the country. But the king didn't want to lose that slavery. He had too good a thing going. And so he said no, as God told Moses the king would do. So, and I believe many of you know this part of the story, God sent 10 plagues on Egypt to convince the king to let the Israelites leave. And another part of sending these plagues, God said, was, I want to show the Pharaoh who's really in charge. Pharaoh thinks it's him. It's not, it's me. And so the plagues began with water turning into blood and ended up with the death of the children of the Egyptians, not the Israelites, but only the Egyptians. So with that final plague, the king said, okay, you can leave. But then, as he'd done before, he changed his mind and he sent his army, people of Israel, to bring them back to Egypt. And then comes another very well-known part of Moses' story, perhaps the best one. There the Israelites were leaving Egypt. They came to a sea, a body of water, and they said, how are we going to get across? And then they looked behind them, and there was the Egyptian army. That's the old proverbial between a rock and a hard place. But God split the water so that the Israelites could cross on dry land. And then when the Egyptians got close, the Lord bowed down their chariots. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, and the waters came back and drowned the pursuing Egyptians. So Exodus chapter 14 concludes with these words. The Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. And then in chapter 15, Moses offered a song of praise to God for what he had done. And then his sister Miriam, what Moses had said with her song. And then we read toward the end of chapter 15, the Lord provided sweet water for them to drink. And here's what he said to them. Listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight. He heals you. So now with these first 15 chapters summarized, we move on to the rest of the story. The rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we only have 122 more chapters to get to today. Hope you brought your lunch. Well, Pop-Tart might help maybe DoorDash with it. Never fear, in these next few minutes, I'm going to just give you a few of the highlights and the rest of these 4 books of the Old Testament tell Moses' story. But again, if you haven't read them, do that. So now, as the people travel through the wilderness, what do they need? Well, 2 of the basics are they need water and they need food. And the Lord provided this surprising food called manna, which in Hebrew, manna means, what is it? But this amazing food is what sustained the Israelites through their time in the wilderness as they traveled back to the land that God promised them. And remember that as the Lord told Moses that he would be with him, the message from God to Moses and his people was, I will be with you as you make this long journey. And so the people were asked to trust that the Lord would provide, even out in the wilderness. Now, the Bible tells us it took 40 years for Moses and his people to get from Egypt back to what we often call. The joke that I first heard from a woman was in seminary about this, was something like this. Why did it take Moses so long to get to the promised land to lead his people there? Well, because like most men, he wouldn't stop. Men grown, the women might be like it a little more. In any case, during this time, the Lord gave the Israelites his laws, including the 10 Commandments. And you may remember the story about when Moses was up on the mountain talking to God, and the people built an idol in the form of a golden calf. And so when Moses came down from the mountain, he was very angry, and there were some severe consequences to the faithless action of people. And Moses continually called for the people to have faith in God, to remember how God had helped them, what God had done for them. He was providing for them then. And yet some of the people even said, oh, Moses, let's go back to Egypt. We had better. Moses continued to lead his people and to remind them how God had been faithful. And now we make the big jump to the last 4 verses of the book. Without looking, can you spell Deuteronomy? How about Leviticus? Well, I know you can spell Numbers. Yeah, anyway. But at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses has led his people to the promised land. But because of Moses' lack of trust in God, at one point Moses was allowed to see the land, but he was not allowed to enter. And so Deuteronomy concludes with Moses after leading his people out of Egypt. This land God had promised him. Moses now comes to the end of his life. And here's what part of those last verses of Deuteronomy say. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like who is unequal for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, and for all the mighty deeds and all the displays of power that Moses performed in Israel. There's so much more we can say about Moses. But as unique as Moses' call was, call that came from God, and as daunting, to put it mildly, as that call was, I believe Moses' story is one of hope, even hope for us all. I believe when God calls us to be about his work in some way, I believe God calls all of us, some, to be part of his work. And when God gives us his call, he promises that he will be with us to help us, as daunting as the job we're called to do may seem to us. And when we fall short, as will at all times, there is forgiveness, as there was for Moses. And you might read one other part of the New Testament. I'm not going to take the time to read it this morning, but it's called the Transfiguration of Jesus, when Moses appeared and Elijah appeared to Jesus and 3 disciples on the mountain. You can find one version of that in Matthew 17, and I think it speaks to the forgiveness of Moses. But the people of Israel too often lost faith in God when times tough. And I guess that at times we'd all fit that description, especially when times are tough. But just as Moses encouraged his people, let us not lose hope that God will be with us and guide us whatever we face. And so I say to you, let us listen for God's call to us, because I believe in some way God is calling us. And let us trust that God has a part to play for us in his work. That God will be with us as we step out in faith to do that work. And that as God's forgiven people, glorious